This is strengthening our climate messages. I'm Caroline Gleich, and I've got Molly Kawahata and Graham Zimmerman. Welcome to the session. So just like ice climbing or skiing, backcountry skiing or running, biking, all of these sports, talking about climate change is a skill, and it's one we can really improve through training and through like working out those muscles. So it's something we need to practice often at work, play, online, and with friends and family in order to create meaningful changes in carbon emissions. In today's session, we're going to talk about best practices for communicating about climate and how we can make our messages stronger, more inclusive, and more resilient. With me today, I have Molly Kawahata and Graham Zimmerman. And so I have a funny story of when I first met Molly. She was a policy advisor for energy and climate at the White House during the Obama administration. And she was hosting this call about a climate initiative by the White House. I accidentally messed up the time of this call with the White House. And I was on a trail run without cell phone coverage, and I just totally blew it. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm such a failure. But luckily they had another call. So I got to have my meeting with the White House, which just looked so cool on my calendar invite. So Molly started the Act on Climate social media campaign through the Obama White House, currently has over 130,000 Instagram posts. And a few months later, I met Molly on a trip to DC with Protect Our Winters. We instantly bonded. Now she works on clean energy in the tech sector. She's on the board of the San Francisco League of Conservation Voters. And she's one of the brightest people I know with a special talent for climate messaging. Graham Zimmerman is an alpinist, creative, and climate activist, and the climbing team captain for Protect Our Winters. He's been on over 30 expeditions to many parts of the world where he's established dozens of significant new routes on rock, ice, and snow. And he's won numerous awards for his climbing, including the Gold Medal of Alpine Climbing, the Pile d'Or, I think that's how you say it. I'm not very good at French, for an ascent in 2019. And that's so cool, Graham. So badass. And so Graham and Molly and everyone else, welcome to the chat.
Caroline, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much for making time. And so let's roll into it. So how did you both get started in this work of climate, in communicating about the climate crisis?
Molly, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in. So as Caroline mentioned, I worked in policy. I was a policy advisor on energy and climate for the Domestic Policy Council at the White House 2 administrations ago, which sounds so long ago, under President Obama. And in that period, we were working on implementing really sweeping at the time policies to cut greenhouse gas emissions within U.S. borders on the domestic side that were intended to provide our negotiators with international leverage to negotiate the Paris Climate Agreement. And what I started to find is that really you cannot have policy without getting the American people on board. Yeah. And to get the American people on board, you have to meet them where they are. And that's something that we don't often do. So what I started to understand is that climate change is not only a policy issue that needs to be addressed systemically, it's also something that we need to address in people's minds and people's brains and in their emotions. And so I started getting down this track of figuring out how to harness the power of psychology and neuroscience in order to more effectively message climate and help activists, organizations, companies improve their climate messaging, make it more inclusive, make it more effective, and meet more people where they are.
Wow, that's so cool. And Graham.
Molly, that's badass.
So badass. Yeah.
Let's see. So I actually studied glaciology in university, glaciohydrology, like how water flows over, through, and under glaciers. So I've been aware of glaciology, of climate change for a long time. But when I finished university, which was, 10 or 15 years ago now, I was also just hell-bent on going climbing. And I've spent most of the last 15 years pursuing that goal of being a professional alpinist and going and trying to do the hardest climbs that I can. And through that process, I've been spending time in the mountains, a lot of time, and I've been seeing the changes that are taking place in our high altitude and high latitude geographies, and those are the areas that are being most affected. Mm-hmm. And with this background in glaciology, I could see what was going on. But for me, as somebody who, is traveling a lot, was going on a lot of these trips, I didn't consider myself someone who could communicate on climate because of the fact that I had, a pretty dramatic carbon footprint.
Yes.
And it wasn't until about 5 years ago that I sat down with some friends who were working over at Protect Our Winters. And I think we were like at a film festival or something, and we were drinking beer, and we started talking about my background and what I've done. And they were just like, oh man, like, why are you not communicating on climate? Why are you not being an advocate? And I was like, well, like I fly all the time. I can't do that. And they were the ones who really coached me through that idea that like imperfect advocacy is okay and imperfect advocacy is important. And that's really been the primary driver of the advocacy work that I've done. And these days I still do the climbing thing a lot. And then I also run a content production company. And most of that is based in storytelling of like how we can, share our stories, how we can utilize them to drive our own advocacy. And for me personally, all that advocacy tends to be around climate and its intersection with some of the other major issues that we're dealing with.
So cool. Yeah. I was always sort of like a nature loving hippie as a kid, loved to climb trees. Like I was a total tree hugger. I'm not going to lie. And I always just wanted to figure out a way to make a positive change in the world. My heart was always drawn to be a pro skier, but my parents really wanted me to become like a politician or a lawyer. So when I was getting ready to graduate from college, I did an internship for the governor of the state of Utah's environmental advisor. And I learned a lot about policy, and I learned a lot about Utah's addiction to fossil fuels as well. And I was really discouraged working that job, but it was really clear to me at the end of that internship that my calling was to pursue my dream of becoming a professional skier and to use that as my lever to talk about climate and to try to create a positive change in the world. And what's been really cool too for me on the journey is that also being an advocate for gender equality and social justice. I think what's happening right now with climate and with climate communication is that all these messages, we're starting to see them less as like individual things and more as a big thing. And so I've been really fascinated too by just the evolution of climate messaging, and then how it relates to gender equality and other social justice issues. And so what I'm curious from both of you with the backgrounds you have is, what have you learned about talking about climate to the public?
I can jump in there, unless Graham, you want to go first.
Oh, no, go for it.
Yes. So I've been really thinking about where the environmental movement has taken us, and it's had incredible strides and accomplishments and has made so much progress for all of us. At the same time, the environmental movement has a history of racism, non-inclusivity, and I believe has misled us in a lot of directions. A good example of this is when we think about kind of greening our lives. And so let me talk about this for a second. The idea of an individual carbon footprint, which is something that Graham mentions, you would think that it came from some kind of environmental effort, right? What if I told you that the term individual carbon footprint was popularized in a 2000 major PR campaign by a company called, a major corporation, British Petroleum, or BP, as in BP oil spill, those folks, major fossil fuel company. In this huge PR campaign, I believe it was $100 million, they hired a really prominent company called Ogilvy and Mather that basically created this massive effort to make people think about their individual carbon footprint. Now, yes, this term did exist before, but once this campaign started, you can see in literature analyses that the term individual carbon footprint shot up, huge. Like you can see the graph and it's like, boom, 2000. And what really happened is environmentalists took this torch and ran with it. And this idea of greening our lives, of looking inward and of looking at each other became a really big part of the environmental movement. And as an extension of that, environmental shaming became a huge tool. And we see this play out a lot in the outdoor industry, that when I work with a lot of professional climbers, a lot of professional skiers and athletes who are doing the right thing by wanting to use their platform for good, things Graham just talked about his journey into doing, things Caroline has been doing since the start, and started getting massive amounts of flack for the fact that, I mean, even threats for the fact that they were trying to use their platform for good because they were told that you're not doing it right. The reason an individual carbon footprint is not something that I believe we should be thinking about is because it's made up. It is a complete construct. And the way this metric is created is that you take a system that is based in fossil fuels and you basically break up that system and force the blame onto the end user that's forced to use it. This is really problematic. And MIT did a paper where they actually found that a Buddhist monk and a man experiencing homelessness, they both had unsustainable carbon footprints. If you want to give up your home, right? If you want to give up, you know, all of these facets of a normal modern life, then you still will not succeed in lowering your carbon footprint to a sustainable level because of this made up metric.
Right.
That was created by a fossil fuel company. So this idea of greening our lives, it's fossil fuel propaganda.
Yeah.
This is something that has not been widely understood, not been widely acknowledged, and it's a story that has not been told. Now, I want to be clear. Living your life in an environmentally minded way is a noble thing. And everybody who can do it, wants to do it, has the privilege of doing it, and can incur the costs of doing it, should do it. And what we really need to acknowledge is that greening your life is a really good way of living out your truths, aligning your life with your values, living a life you're proud of. And everybody should keep doing it that can. But it is different from fighting climate change. Sustainable living is in one category and fighting climate change is another, but we cannot mix up the two. So when I, use electricity in the evening between the hours of 4 to 9 p.m., am I polluting? An individual carbon footprint person would tell me, yeah. And when you say, okay, what's the solution here? They literally say, maybe just don't use as much electricity, which is ridiculous. And this is the thing. This is a policy in California with utilities. They're called time of use rates, where if you use electricity when you need it most, which is the hours of 4 to 9 p.m., when natural gas is likely to be online, then what happens is that they charge you more, and they encourage you to do your laundry after 9 p.m. Things that aren't really as easy for people who don't have as much flexibility, which tend to be lower income families and things like that. So they're really damaging policies. But beyond that, we have to think about, is the solution to just not use electricity? I'm living in the only system I have ever been given.
Yeah.
We need to stop shaming other people for being forced to live in it too. And what we need to do is much more broadly acknowledge that the system we are forced to live under is based in fossil fuels. We cannot fight climate change by greening our lives. And here's the secret. All of us cannot fight climate change by greening all of our lives. The numbers do not add up. And anybody who has told you otherwise, they're lying to you about the math. I think that's a really important thing to underscore. The impact is not there. We need systemic change. And systemic change is government action and it's policy. And we use the political process to do that. So the number one question I get in my work is, what can I do to fight climate change? And I think that's a wonderful question. I love it when people ask me that. But the thing is, oftentimes when people ask that question, they're told by people, change what you eat, change how you get around, change how you live your life. Now, if you're new to the climate movement and you want to join in, is that something that makes you feel included? Is that an inclusive message? I don't believe so. I think that alienates people. What really is more effective, and this is the thing I think every single person who wants climate change, wants climate action should do, is register people to vote. Voting is not enough. We need to register people to vote. This is what we're seeing in Georgia. This is what we just saw. To flip the Senate, what happened wasn't that they were convincing these longtime Republican voters to switch their votes. They expanded the electorate.
Yes.
They enfranchised more communities of color, more lower income individuals. They gave them a voice for the first time. And when you do that, climate candidates get elected. When climate candidates get elected, systemic change is put into place. All of a sudden, the grid I'm using, when I use electricity at night, policies that supported it made the grid cleaner.
Yes.
That's a way more effective way to fight climate change. And that's how we fight it at scale. So I just want to be clear about this. Greening your life, noble. Please keep doing it if you can. If you don't want to do it, if you can't incur the cost of doing it, it's not something, lower income folks can usually do. Do not worry about it. Register people to vote. But the climate movement is one that's supposed to be inclusive. So when I see this stuff on social media about people just shaming people like I've seen with Graham and Caroline, and I jump into the comments and I fight back.
Yes.
Really, what we need to do is recognize that people have taken it upon themselves to gatekeep the environmental movement, to gatekeep the climate movement. And what they're doing is they're systematically silencing people and kicking people out, which I believe nobody has a right to do.
Right.
This is an inclusive movement. If you eat hamburgers, you can be a part of the climate movement. If you are a Republican, you can be a part of the climate movement. If you've never voted, we'll help you vote. And then you should be a part of the climate movement. Everybody is welcome. And I think everybody needs a seat at the table, and we can do that through a number of other means, but the focus needs to be on systemic change. Companies need to stop telling people that they need to make individual changes in their own lives, which often people can't afford to make. Really what they need to be doing is lobbying for policies that support clean energy, energy storage, systemic change. That's what we really need to see.
Well, maybe we should just end this panel right now. No, I'm just kidding. Mic drop, I so much of what you said is amazing. And, the whole thing of the carbon footprint and the shaming and the guilt and the finger pointing amongst environmentalists, like you can see how effective that BP campaign and the PR was, because instead of unifying around a shared goal and vision of decarbonizing economies and creating rapid and, measurable reductions in carbon emissions. Instead, we're wasting our energy bickering online with people who probably have the same goals that we do. And so I think
which is what the fossil fuel companies wanted, by the way. That's effective. They broke up the environmental movement and they made their enemies, people who are fighting them to create good in the world, they made them their biggest advocates.
Yeah, and I just have to, I want to talk more about this with one of the challenges, but that shame and guilt and the finger pointing and the ad hominem attacks, like it silenced my voice on climate for many years. It made I actually had to get a home security system because I was so afraid from some of the personal threats that I was getting. And so I wanted, on the note of what Molly just went over, Graham, I wanted to hear about some of the work that you've been doing to get people out to vote and to get people mobilized around that.
Yeah, I'll dive into the voting stuff here in just a minute. But I think that before I do, I kind of want to take, Molly, what you're talking about and sort of apply it directly, because we're talking to the outdoor industry and the outdoor community here. And I want to apply it directly to us, to those of us who love to go outside, who love to go, go drive or fly to the mountains or to the rivers or to the ocean. And, the framework that has been presented to us by BP, and that we've, many of us have really bought into accidentally, really tells us that you have a choice of either being an environmentalist or being somebody who loves to go, rage in the mountains. And, when I look back at my past, I see that I made that choice to go to the mountains. And because of that, I felt like I could not be somebody who spoke up on climate. I could not be somebody who even really had an opinion. And Caroline, like you mentioned, I know that's had some pretty scary consequences for you. And so if we're going to, leading down to kind of the logical conclusion of that BP argument, I solved the climate crisis by, only eating vegetables, by not traveling at all, by not heating my house, that's going to put us in a position where, we are in our small domicile, we're eating vegetables out of the backyard with which we don't use fertilizer, and and we're not utilizing the internet, we're not utilizing any modern technology. And as we set that kind of against progress in society and things like that, it just is a non-compute. It also means that you are never going to be an effective advocate if you are just hiding out in your dark house all the time. Right. So I think what we kind of need to do is reframe our vision of what our individual lives should look like with the systemic change that we're looking to create. And instead of me wanting to stop going on as many trips and stop eating meat, which are both, I guess, things that I've done, to your point, Molly, living an examined life is important. But I think that we need to shift our vision towards, if I want to go from Bend, Oregon, where I live, and I want to go ice climb in the Canadian Rockies, or if I want to go to Pakistan, how do I create the systemic change that needs to take place in order for me to do those things in a carbon neutral or carbon efficient manner? How do I set it up so that I am charging my EV at home and it's on a grid that is running off of renewables, and I drive that to the Canadian Rockies and I plug my car in up there, once again on a renewable grid. I go climb up there and I drive home, and I've done that trip that right now is something that I would get shit about, because how can you be a environmental and climate activist while you're going on these trips? But I'm doing that in a carbon neutral way. And that's our goal. Our goal is not to give up the things that we love. Our goal is to be able to do the things that we love in a carbon neutral or carbon efficient manner. And one other kind of point to that, and this kind of gets back to Caroline, what you were asking about, of like, how do we get people to vote? How do we get people on this bandwagon? You know, for all of us here, certainly the three of us, and I think most of the people who are here listening and engaging, you know, we love to spend time in the outdoors. We love to go out to these places, and the outdoors are a very important part of our story. And the outdoors are a place where we're seeing that change take place, that, you know, those climatic changes, where the climate crisis is happening. And it's not happening in the air-conditioned offices in DC. It's not happening in the air-conditioned offices in Salem, Oregon, our capital. So that is our story. And it is our responsibility to set ourselves up so that we can go do these things that we love in a sustainable, carbon neutral way by utilizing the stories that we have from these places where climate change is showing up and impacting our lives, and utilize those stories to drive that systemic change. And I think that as we look at kind of how we can get people to vote, how we can get people to engage, how we can be more inclusive with this messaging, I think that story component is going to be key.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you said about just going on those trips and starting your climate stories around that is really powerful, because I think that in order also to create like a next generation of climate activists and people who love nature and the planet and the earth, like, we have to make sure that people have access to outdoor recreation. I mean, like, before you want to expect people to advocate for public land protection, that actually plays an important part in the broader idea of, you know, taking action on climate. Like, protecting public land has positive benefits for the environment and for the climate especially. I think a lot of people don't always know that connection, but getting people outside, getting people to fall in love with the land, and I think that's a really also an important first step. And so, like, how should we be writing and speaking about climate?
Yeah, and I just want to really quickly, like, exactly what Caroline and Graham were getting at. I mean, do I believe getting on a plane is an immoral act on your part? No. You didn't choose for that plane to be powered by fossil fuels. The climate change is not the fault of everyday people. Climate change is the fault of a system that we've been given and are forced to live in. So rather than just not take flights or just not use electricity at night, ultimately, what we could do is instead, for example, support policies that are going to decarbonize the aviation sector. And this is the work of mitigation policy. This is decarbonization at the source, at the sector, like double-digit percentage cuts in emissions from sectors. That's really what we need to see, so that when you get on a plane for your job, when you turn on the lights at night, it's not polluting as much. And ultimately, that is that connection between registering people to vote, climate candidates going in systemic change taking place. And then, Caroline, to kind of get at your question about how to message this in a more effective way. So at the White House, we actually went on a journey to figure out what is the most effective way to talk about climate change. And there are a lot of different frames, because climate change impacts every facet of American life. And what we found was actually really shocking. So you can message climate around national security. This is things like natural disasters, FEMA response, flood standards, adaptation and resilience. Ultimately, while it's really effective for folks that live that, most people, that's not part of their everyday lives. So it's actually not an effective way to meet everyday people where they are. You can message it as an economic issue. And at a macro scale, this is what we're talking about. So it's saying for every decade we don't fight climate change, we're incurring this much additional cost in our economy. Basically, inaction costs more than action. Again, at a macro scale, that's harder for somebody to relate to. It's very abstract. So it's not part of their everyday life. We tested the environmental frame, and people inextricably believe that, climate is a purely environmental issue, and it's not. It's all of these issues, right? So we did test the environmental frame. This is what has dominated the climate framing for the last 2 decades, and it really started with, Al Gore. This is polar bears in the Arctic. This is melting glaciers. While that's really important for scientists to talk about, while it's really important for Alpinists to talk about, who that's part of, what Graham's saying, that's part of your lived experience. Caroline is out in the snow all the time. That's part of their lived experience, their story. It's authentic. It makes sense for them to be talking about that. San Francisco environmentalists who are trying to reach people where they are, who are trying to reach new voters, it's not as effective for them to talk about it because, we have tremendous income inequality in America, and a mom working 2 jobs doesn't have the luxury of caring about things happening thousands and thousands of miles away. That's not part of her authentic story. What we found, by far, unequivocally, and by most effective way for us to talk about climate change is through the lens of public health, because nothing is more personal and relevant to you in your everyday life than the health and well-being of your children, your family, your parents, the people around you, your community. And let me explain what this means, because public health is not widely seen as an environmental issue. But when we talk about climate justice, that's a term that's thrown around a lot. But climate justice becomes climate justice when we talk about public health. That is the intersection. And another word for climate change is just pollution. So again, we tend to separate clean air from climate change. They are one in the same. Carbon is co-emitted with a lot of other pollutants. And fossil fuel power plants, coal-fired power plants, emit a ton of pollution. They dirty up the air, and the community that's forced to breathe that air is statistically significantly likelier to be low income and communities of color. And that has devastating impacts on their public health. So one thing that people never believe me when I say, and they always fact check me, but it's true, thanks to the NAACP that has documented a lot of this research, is that 1 in 10 Black children in America has asthma. I'm going to say that again. 10% of American Black children have asthma. That's an atrocious statistic. That's an unacceptable statistic. And climate change is also responsible for greater heart disease, greater lung disease, tick-borne illnesses. It means missed work days, which have economic impacts for families. It means premature death, which means that parents can no longer provide for their families. It's really a big problem. So when we message climate change in terms of public health, we're really empowering the communities that have been the original climate activists, which are communities of color that have been fighting for clean air and clean water for their children for decades. Long before Al Gore made a film, long before climate change was even a term, they've been fighting for this. And the environmental movement for a long time didn't give them a seat at the table. They built the table. So public health is absolutely what we need to be talking about. The environmental movement and the outdoor industry have really run with this idea of, climate as purely an environmental issue, but we need to expand. And when all of these organizations want to be reaching new folks and want to be more inclusive and want to be talking to communities of color and including them, you have to talk about public health. And it's not something that might have this immediate connection to, national parks and things like that, but it's really important that you find a way to integrate that into your messaging. So when we talk about public health, people start caring, people start voting for climate candidates, and we start getting systemic change. I know, I'm saying the same thing over and over because it's true.
Yeah.
So talking about public health is absolutely something we need to integrate more into our narratives.
Molly, that's awesome. I really appreciate that perspective. And I think that something that you've done a lot, and this, Caroline, this gets back to what you were talking about earlier and kind of how you framed this conversation originally, is practicing how we talk about this stuff. Yeah. Getting used to this, utilizing, not just hearing this right now and kind of trying to ingest it and then going off to do the next thing, taking what you're learning from Molly right now and trying to share that with family members, trying to share that with people who you trust, build that, build those muscles, build that ability to share this kind of thing. And the thing is that this is disruptive work. This is stuff that a lot of people don't really want to hear. a lot of people have been really sold. They've been sold the idea kind of back with it. They can solve the carbon footprint by recycling, or they can solve the climate crisis by recycling. And so they put their glass in their recycling bin and they're like, great, I did my part. And it's like, that's not going to work. And I'm sorry to wreck your day, but like, you need to do a lot more. And that's hard to tell people that, and people don't want to hear it. And we need to practice how we communicate on the stuff, what we're communicating, and we need to get used to talking to people about it on a regular basis, because this shit is really important. And Molly, you're really good at communicating this stuff. It's amazing. I mean, I'll take the recording of this video and like try to, take the points that you've laid out and put them in my own words and try them out on my wife, Shannon, and see how it goes, because that's like how we move this forward.
Yeah, I think it's just constantly practicing it and finding ways to bring it up in different conversations and in different contexts. And one other thing that I've learned about climate messaging and communicating about the climate crisis is it's really about saying the same things over and over. I mean, you don't even need to switch it up that much. I think once you understand these things, you can really recycle a lot of the same messaging. One of the things, even if you're not a public health expert, it doesn't matter. Like if you live on this planet and you breathe the air, like you can express those concerns, and there's so much power from active, engaged citizens. So
100%. And I think that's a really important thing. What Caroline's getting at is message penetration. Again, like we tend to believe that the truth speaks for itself. That's not how human brains work. They need to receive and understand information through what Graham was saying of a story, because things have a beginning, middle, and end. That's how we understand information. Metaphors are a very effective way for the human brain to receive information. And you need to say it over and over and over. That's what marketing is. That's why marketing is powerful. It's based in psychology. It's evidence-based. And when we're not using that in the climate movement, we're not getting messages in people's brains. Every talk I give, I say like the same stuff. I hope people don't listen to more than one of my podcasts, because they're all the same. You say the same thing over and over, and then people finally get it. And I'll give you a good example of this. How many people could tell you what Donald Trump's campaign slogan was? Make America Great Again. Can anybody understand what Joe Biden's slogan was, what Hillary Clinton's slogan was? I worked on her campaign. I barely know what her slogan was, because we didn't repeat it over and over and over. He understood. He's a businessman. He understood how to get stuff in people's brains. It's scary. We didn't want that in there, but he was effective. So that's something really important, what she's talking about.
So wait, if you could make the slogan for this, what would it be for brands? If we were to like all come together and make slogan, what would it be? And maybe that's a different session, but like, I'd be super curious.
I can talk a little bit about framing really quickly. I don't want to talk too much in this, but I can talk a little bit about framing, because this is, again, how we're using neuroscience and psychology to talk about climate change in a way that's effective, that gets in people's brains. So every time you have a thought, it actually fires a web of neurons in your brain. And when you have that thought again, it fires that web of neurons and it grows stronger. And that means that thought is likelier to arise. In neuroscience, there's this quote of neurons that fire together, wire together. So what Donald Trump did, when I keep talking about this, he kept saying, make America great again, make America great again. It fired that web of neurons in your brain, in millions of people's brains, over and over and over, to the point where he was inextricably linked to America being made great again. It was a very effective frame. Even if you didn't believe it, even if you understood he's a terrible president who's doing terrible things for the climate, people put those two things together, and that has power, even without the endorsement. So for example, there's a really common climate frame that's put out there that climate action hurts the economy. And this is an anti-climate narrative. What happens is that a lot of times, rather than reframe, we take those narratives and we respond to them. So it would be me going next to that guy and yelling, no, climate action does not hurt the economy. In the 80s, they did a psychology study where they actually asked people to not think of a white bear. So like Caroline and Graham, if I told you, don't think of a white bear right now, tell me what you're thinking about.
A white bear?
It's so cuddly. It's so cute.
Exactly. Like the Coca-Cola bear, a polar bear, right? Like you literally are thinking about what they tell you not to think about. My direction was do not think about it. It didn't matter because I was firing the neurons of white bear. So that's what's in your brain. And if I said, don't think of a white bear all week, and then later somebody asks you, hey, what's an animal? You're now likelier to think of a white bear, because that's the phenomenon of priming in psychology. So when I say no, climate action does not hurt the economy, I am still wiring climate action in a hurt economy. That's wired. So then I'm likelier to, when you say climate action, I'm likelier to now think about a hurt economy, whether or not you say it. What happens here is what's associated with this frame are ideas of balance and compromise. Now, environmentalists are constantly responding to this frame. Whenever you hear somebody say, climate action is worth it, we need to act because it's worth it, they're implicitly saying worth the sacrifices. Now, what we're doing now is we're starting with our legs cut off. We're now saying, hey, I'm ready to start with the point of like, how much are we willing to compromise and sacrifice for climate action? Now, this is just inaccurate. Climate action creates jobs. It grows GDP. It's good for the economy. It's good for people's lives. It's in our best interest, and economic opportunity is inextricably linked with climate. But we haven't said that enough. So one thing we had President Obama say all the time was, climate change represents the greatest economic opportunity of the 21st century. Now, what are we wiring? It's climate action and economic opportunity. Yeah. Now, we need to say that more so that that's wired in people's brains. When they hear economic opportunity, they're now likelier to think about climate action, and vice versa. So ultimately, this is the power of neuroscience. This is the power of psychology and using evidence-based things. Now, what we need to do, what I was just saying, is we need to frame this in terms of public health. So I can now reframe it completely out of the economic sphere, and I can now say something like, join me in fighting climate change for the health and well-being of our children.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound like I'm saying much at first, but here's why this is powerful. Because when you think about climate action and herd economy, those are concepts, like I mentioned, of balance and sacrifice. So you're saying, what balance and sacrifice do I need to strike for us to take action? When you talk about the health and well-being of your children, there are no concepts of balance and sacrifice. You do not find balance in the health and well-being of your children. You do not compromise on that. You fight for it at all costs. And that's what we need to do with climate change. We need to fight for it at all costs. So it's a way more effective frame to talk about climate change because of what's associated with that. This is how you meet people where they are. If companies can start talking more about public health, you will broaden your audience. You'll probably even broaden your customer base. And you're going to get more climate candidates elected in the process. More systemic change is going to happen, even indirectly.
Yeah. I mean, when I was doing some research for, I testified to the House Natural Resources Committee last year about climate change in public lands. And I really leaned in on Molly's advice to bring in this public health element. And I found that air pollution and poor air quality from climate change emissions is linked to like higher rates of miscarriage. And that one struck me really strong because I've had quite a few of my friends in Salt Lake who've had more miscarriages, and it's anecdotal, but on the other hand, climate change is good for fertility. It's good for sperm count. I think that that's another good way to approach it, especially when we're talking like to a lot of religious or, in Salt Lake, it's predominantly in Utah, we have a large Mormon population. And so I just love that framing so much. And I wanted to also just drop a note that if you have any questions in the chat, we'll have a few minutes to answer those. So put any questions in the chat and we'll get to those. It's the other thing that I learned from one of the earliest trainings I did with Protect Our Winters is like, don't ever say climate change is real, because framing it that way, it's like climate change is not Santa Claus. It's not the tooth fairy. It's not something that you choose to believe in. Like, science doesn't care. Like, gravity doesn't care if you believe in it. If you jump out of a window, right? You're going to fall from a building if you jump out of like a high up building. So it's going to happen whether you believe in it or not. And so like, I know I'm telling you the wrong, like, I'm like, don't frame it as real or make believe, it's science, and it's the scientific process.
The amount of deniers that we have around it's very few. So we don't really need to worry about them. We need to be activating the people who are like kind of on the fence, like not really worried about it. We can move them into the concerned territory.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Molly, Molly, can I ask you a question about one thing that you brought up earlier? You used the term meeting people where they're at, which is something that a lot of the communications that I do are kind of in smaller settings. A lot of our kind of climbing communications are pretty intimate. They're places where we can very much have a conversation. And something I've been working on a lot, and a lot of this comes from a book that I would recommend or would love folks' opinion on, called Harvest the Vote by a woman named Jane Cleave. And it's all about how we should be listening more as well, so that we're not just like blasting people with this information. We need to be meeting people where they're at. And the way that we do that is to actually kind of be quiet and listen to them speak, and then frame their story in the terms of climate, so that then we, instead of just, telling them what they need to do, which is so easy, particularly from like a branding perspective, it's such an easy thing to do, but instead kind of give them the little nuggets that they need in order to build this climate story into their own story. And therefore it becomes something that is linked, both story-wise and neurologically, so that it becomes something that is theirs.
Yeah, I mean, completely. The more we can appeal to everyday people who, again, have been told repeatedly by environmentalists that like we're at fault for climate change. I hate this. There's this idea of like, I hear this all the time. Look what we've done. We've destroyed the environment. And like, yes, I get what you're saying and your heart's in the right place, but climate change is not the fault of everyday people. So when we can talk about that to them through stories and narratives that are related to their everyday lives, which Graham is talking about, and Caroline does every day, that's a way more effective way to reach them. That's also how you reach voters, right? You talk about what matters to them in life. And one thing that matters to every single person, again, is their health. And so that's why I keep going back to that. I do want to touch on one thing that Caroline was saying earlier about, so one thing too, I started to realize is like, we often say, save the planet, save the earth. The planet will be here no matter what we do. The earth will be here. And I was like, climate change isn't about saving the earth. It's about saving our children. It's about saving our families, ourselves, future generations. And like, I was just like, at what point did we start fucking using outer space metaphors to talk about climate change? Is there anything more powerful or resilient than a planet in a solar system? That is not how you meet people where they are. Again, a mom working 2 jobs and trying to get by doesn't have the luxury of thinking about things that are so not right in front of her. But we can talk about things that are right in front of people, because that's truly what climate change is doing.
This is our thing to deal with. The earth will be fine. We got to deal with our own shit.
Well, yeah, and I think that's one of the things I love about being a skier and being in the outdoors, is it just reminds you of the fragility and like the place of humans in the bigger ecosystem. And like when you're out there and you're in a 60-mile-per-hour wind gust storm, you really feel like exposed. You feel fragile, like you're not protected in this bubble of comfort of modern society. Like, and so it really reminds you like that we're not superior. We're not conquerors of nature. Like we are merely granted passage, and that nature is not something to rape or to pillage or exploit for our own personal gain, but it's a force to be like respected, and also to be, just to understand that we're a part of it. So the question we had, and I want to pose this to both of you, I put one of the ideas I had. What are 1 or 2 actions we can take to affect policy change for climate justice without becoming a full-time lobbyist? And what I said is to donate or volunteer or just sign up for email alerts for your local grassroots environmental nonprofits. Just reading those email alerts and submitting comments at the local level, creating that grassroots support, it could really create lasting change. So that was my advice. I'd love to hear from both of you.
I can go. Make sure that you're voting. Make sure that you are registered to vote. Maybe that's kind of assumed if you're in this conversation, but number one thing. And then, I think that calling your reps, calling your senators, writing them is this thing that like has kind of a stigma around it. Like it's hard. It's a big deal. It's something that like should be reserved for, only when I have time and when I really have a super well formulated opinion on something. And it's really not hard at all. It doesn't take any time. And it's a really easy thing to like get a few friends together and be like, cool, let's all call our reps. Let's like get on a Zoom call, hang out, like we'll make a cocktail and we'll barrage our senator or barrage our congressman and congressperson. And yeah, it's like it can be something that doesn't need to be like getting involved with our democracy doesn't have to be this big, hard, scary thing. It can actually be a lot of fun. And I think kind of reframing it so that it's something that is fun, and doing that with our friends and our family and those who we speak to is a great way to get involved.
Graham, I love that advice so much. And I think that relationship building with elected officials is super important, because it's not something it's best if we can do it often, because it's like the squeaky wheel gets the grease or the oil, which is not a metaphor I really want to use for this panel, but you know what I mean. So to keep being that voice in their ear and to keep bugging them and to keep asking and speaking up, because it's not like a one-time thing. Unfortunately, like it's like we got to be relentless in our pursuit of this. Molly, thoughts?
I mean, I love this, because what Graham and Caroline are talking about is systemic change. They are talking about engaging at the local, state, federal levels in policy making from the outside. And what Caroline's saying, yeah, you do not need to be a full-time lobbyist. You do not have to quit your job and become a climate activist full-time. Really, what Graham was describing earlier about, like, yeah, you can sit in a dark house and you have like a very much lower carbon footprint, although it's not that much lower, but like minimize your carbon footprint and like feel good about yourself. And then you can't be an activist who's like out there doing stuff. Yeah, but you don't need to go fully in the opposite direction. The truth is, this stuff that they're talking about is easy. It's way easier than changing every element of your life and incurring those costs and inconveniences and lowering your quality of life. Ultimately, if you get a few friends on a Sunday and you go register people to vote for a few hours at the local farmers market, that's going to be way more effective. And like, there are elections where a couple people determined the election. It happens a lot. And also, like, the denominator is just much smaller. Like, the number of voters we have down here, when you can increase the numerator, it's going to have a way bigger impact than whatever your carbon footprint is, which is like 17 to 18 tons of carbon out of 30 billion, right? Like, let's think about the math here. So that's what they're talking about. Registering people to vote, getting involved with your local grassroots nonprofit. A lot of them are going to be providing you with a lot of what Graham's talking about, a lot of the information for when to call your senator. They'll literally give you like an email where you just press send, or like a thing that you read for 2 sentences when you call them. Engaging in this policymaking process. And a huge, huge part of this is campaigns. So whoever your local elected official is, like, think about who is the climate candidate. And yes, I guarantee they're not going to be a perfect one. You know, Graham's talking about imperfect activism. They are not going to be perfect, but support the climate candidate and help them get elected. Because when that happens, that takes a lot of the burden off you. Again, you can use your electricity in the evening. They're decarbonizing the aviation sector through R&D research on hydrogen, right? Like, all of these things where you can live your life because we're making it cleaner on the other end. So systemic change, anything related to politics and elected officials and campaigns, is going to be your best avenue for climate action.
Okay.
I was going to chime in with one thing. I think a really important point that you made, Molly, is, you know, we think about the federal level a lot. We think about the presidency a lot. When looking at state and regional politics is just as or more important. And to get back to Molly's geeky numerator denominator analogy, which I thought was great, it's a much smaller pool. The work that we were able to execute on here in Bend, Oregon in this last election, in which we flipped our city council and now have like a liberal city council that is getting behind the climate action plan and like making stuff happen on a local level. It was way easier, and I was able to affect way more change here than I was on the state, or federal level. And those are, in like getting back to Caroline's point, where, forming relationships with these people, it's pretty hard for me to form a real lasting relationship with Jeff Merkley. I mean, he might know who I am, but I'll tell you what, like my state level reps, and like the city council, like they know who I am. We have conversations. We follow each other on Instagram. Those are like places where you can really have dramatic impact and form relationships, and that work matters a lot.
Yeah, and those nonprofits, they have, for me, always been my conduit to like attend those trainings and to do those things and to show up at the right time strategically. And so, okay, I want to do one more question and then we're going to be done. It's from Madison. It says, in terms of holding systems accountable, what do you think the role of brands is? How effective is the voting with your wallet method? Go.
I mean, I think that's part of individual action, right? Like, I think it matters and you can do it. And it's like a good way to align your life with your values. We need systemic change. And what brands and companies need to start doing is they need to kind of stop taking the easy way out on like, hey, this product's going to be a little more green. And like, we're going to encourage you to like recycle. I mean, it's great. Please keep doing it. But you need to be out there using your power and your platforms to lobby for climate policies. That's ultimately how you're going to help your consumer base live more green lives and fight climate change. That's really putting your mouth where your money is you have to be out there. And there are companies who are absolutely doing this, and you see how it benefits them. Yeah. It has benefited their brand. Like Patagonia and Ben & Jerry's and Burton, these companies that are out there like truly advocating for real things that are going to have real impact on the lives of the American people. And in the process, increase their quality of life.
I think really another important point is that like in the outdoor industry, in the outdoor world, our brands are our most vocal storytellers. They are the ones who are telling the stories that are getting in front of the most people. And so that is a huge power that these brands have. And what are you going to do with that power is kind of the question. Are you going to tell stories that just sell more jackets and kind of lead us down this path of, maybe recycle and like go skiing? Or are you going to like lead us down a path where we have a better relationship with our environment, we drive systemic change, and we guide ourselves and our society towards the world that we want to live in?
Yeah. So to answer your question, Madison, I would say like brands have a huge power if they harness it properly. And like by supporting those brands that are really sticking their necks out on the line and are doing like brave and sometimes unpopular things for the betterment of the planet. But I think like there is a big difference between the brands that have a deep commitment to environmental and social responsibility and brands that are purporting sustainability as a way to increase consumerism, like the greenwashing. So to be able to decipher for that between those, that's like a whole nother panel that I'd love to talk about another time, but there is a big difference. So I think it's time to wrap it up. I want to thank you, Molly and Graham, and everyone for tuning in so much. And I can't wait to keep these conversations going. So have a great day, and let's keep it going and talk again soon.